just living the dream under this southern sky. It's where stories are born and legends never die.
Okay, it's Johnny Ponder with Tales of Trails. This is about my 7th podcast. And as always, I try to get a special guest, and I certainly got one today. I got wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service, Mr. Art Henderson. Also, Art is a huge supporter of Munford Schools. So if you ever get a chance to see him out somewhere, be sure to thank him for that. And Art, it's good to have you with me today.
Good to be here, Mr. Ponder. Good to be here.
You, around them schools, you got that habit of calling me Mr. Ponder rather than Johnny, don't you? I understand. And you know, when I got on the school board, that was the hardest thing I had to get used to, is people calling me Mr. Ponder. Because they'd say Mr. Ponder, and I'd look, see if Daddy was standing behind me or something. You know how that is. I will start this off by telling you about Art, and I'm going to let him say a few things about himself, but he has been really instrumental in the red cockaded woodpecker restoration, and he has almost got it to the point now that they're going to cut him off on birds. So I'll let you just kind of get into that and tell us what's going on with it and how you enjoy it. And if you got into something else you do with the Forest Service, that'd be great too.
Okay. Well, we can start off talking a little bit about the red cockaded woodpecker. And you're right, it has been a large part of my career. I'm on year 27 with the Forest Service, and I've spent about 26 of those working with the red cockaded woodpecker, which of course is just one species out of many that I work with, but it is one that kind of drives a lot of the other work that we do with the Forest Service as far as ecosystem restoration.
Explain that, how you manage the timber to also help that.
So our objective is to restore timber to what was here historically, which is looking back to pre-European settlement. Mm-hmm. So looking back to the timber types that were here and the timber structure that was here in the 1800s and early 1900s. So that's kind of the goal is to get back to some of those historical timber types and structure that used to exist across the southeastern United States.
You know, Art, I was reading in a book written by John Bartram, which was a kind of a botanist and a wildlife person, and he came through this country after DeSoto, surveying everything, and he was actually, unlike DeSoto, which he was actually an outlaw, this guy came through trying to identify the plants and animals in our area, and he made this comment that in the southeast United States, you could ride 8 horses abreast across the vast pine savannas. Now, ride up the Cheaha Road and show me a place up there other than something that may be freshly clear-cut that you can ride 8 horses abreast through.
Yes, it has changed dramatically. A lot of the early explorers would talk about expansive pine forest. Another thing that was mentioned was the frequent fires and that maintain those forests. And those frequent fires is also what it drove the species of tree and also determined the different plants and animals that were native there. And one of the things that makes the longleaf pine forest interesting is due to the fact that fire is the driving force, is the diversity of plants and animals that we get because of fire moving across the landscape. Fire does not burn at the same temperature across the landscape. You know, it's hotter on ridge tops, it's cooler in the drains, and then you have everything in between. So you end up with all these micro habitats due to the different temperatures of fire that cross the landscape, which means you get all sorts of different plants and insects and then animals and so on and so forth. So it's a very diverse ecosystem. In longleaf pine forest, you may have over 100 different species of plants in a few square meters. There's lots of forests that don't have fire as part of their, part of them, that their diversity may be 1 or 2 plants every few meters. So the diversity is one of the things that sets the longleaf pine forest apart from the rest, and what sets it apart is the fact that it's fire driven.
And also these RCW, these woodpeckers also depend on longleaf. They depend on that old growth forest, and it's my understanding that, of course, I've been around you, listening to you all these years, so I think I got a fairly good understanding of RCW and the habitat. That they require that. Now, are they known as the keystone species, or is the longleaf pine actually the keystone?
It could be both, but we do refer to the RCW as a keystone species. And the reason is because if it exists, that means the ecosystem is in good enough conditions that lots of other plants and animals can also call it home.
Yes.
So it's a specialist. So if that specialist can exist, that means we're doing something right in the restoration process.
It's almost the same scenario with the freshwater mussels in the water, where if they exist, you know it's healthy for everything else.
That's correct. We have several different T&E mussel species that are located in our streams on Talladega National Forest. And that's because we're really high up in the watershed. You know, Cheaha is the highest point in the state. Mm-hmm. We own most of the land around it. And so we have really high freshwater quality here locally, which gives us a diversity of mussels that's an indicator of, good stream health and water quality.
And the little fish, the little darters or whatever you call a lot of those little fish, those are also an indicator, right?
That's correct. And so the reason those little fish are important is because each little fish has a certain mussel species that it serves as a host for. The mussels, when they reproduce, they release glaucidia with almost like a fishing lure that attracts the fish. The fish comes up and the glaucidia fall into its gills, and then that host fish is what disperses the mussel up and down the stream.
Yeah, a mussel can't swim, can it?
That's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah, so they have to have some way to disperse those young.
They're not very good hikers.
No, that's a very interesting thing, and when you get really into longleaf pine, and if you want to touch on that a good deal, and how it is adapted to our area so well over the years.
Well, the reason it was adapted to the area was the frequent fire. Native Americans burn this area frequently for lots of different reasons, but that frequent fire, along with natural, lightning fires, started the development of the longleaf pine forest over many, many years. And the red-cockaded woodpecker is a specialist because it evolved in this fire-maintained forest and it excavated its cavities in living pine trees, which is the thing that makes it unique among the many different woodpecker species. Is all other woodpeckers are making their cavities in existing cavities, or they're making them in dead pine trees or dead trees.
Yeah.
The red-cockaded woodpecker is making its cavity in a living pine tree. That way, when fire frequently is passing through, their cavity is left untouched because it's in a green tree. The green tree doesn't burn up. The fires are usually more low intensity, passing down underneath their cavity. The reason that it became an endangered species, and it's recently went to a threatened species, so that's good news. We're making progress. The reason is, in order for the red-cockaded woodpecker to excavate a cavity in a living pine tree, it typically has to be at least 100 years old. So the longleaf pine has a big heartwood, and so the red-cockaded woodpecker has to drill through the sapwood and get into the heartwood of the tree, and then excavate a chamber downward into the tree in the heartwood. And so the longleaf pine usually gets the red heart fungus in at about age 100, age 120. The tree's top starts to flatten out, and it makes the heartwood suitable for the red-cockaded woodpecker to excavate its cavity.
A little softer, almost like sawdust.
But since they have to go through the sapwood, that is kind of the hardest part for the bird because they can't get sap in their feathers, or it will kill them.
Oh, really?
And so if they get all sapped up, they can't fly, they can't eat, they end up dying. And so what they have to do is go up and work their entrance tunnel just a little bit to get the sap flow started. They peck a little bit away, let the tree start to bleed, and then they have to leave it alone for a few days for it to harden back over. And they go back up, re-excavate, and keep going until they get all the way through the sapwood and into the heartwood.
So does both the male and the female help with that excavation?
Yes. So both will excavate cavities, but what makes it limiting is the age of the tree. The tree has to be 100 plus years old. And then the other thing is the length of time it takes to make this cavity. So a red-cockaded woodpecker, a quick cavity construction may take 2 years, but it's usually between 2 and 6 years from start to finish for a cavity. And this is for a bird, the average lifespan is maybe 6 to 8 years. So you can tell right away that cavities are kind of the limiting factor for this species. It
Rough
takes
on the bird, isn't it?
It is,
Yeah.
and it takes. I'm glad we're different. We can build
Yeah.
our houses a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
But for this species, having the tree having to be that old, taking that long, and with such a short lifespan, that's what made it. And the reason it became endangered was, in the 1800s, this area was logged, the southeastern United States. We were looking for naval stores, we were looking to build railroads, we were looking to build houses as we settled this area. And all this beautiful pine timber here, we went through and harvested because we were doing all these different things with it. And this species needs the older trees in order to survive. They can't make cavities in a 10-year-old pine tree. They can't do it. And so that's what made their numbers start to dwindle.
Well, when all that started, we thought that it was an inexhaustible resource. We didn't think we would ever cut it all. But we fooled them, didn't we? We sure did.
We did, and there was a couple other things that influenced this. Back in the 1930s and 1940s, we started to realize that we needed to reforest the area. And so a lot of this land here by the federal government was acquired in the 1940s and 1950s, has been cut over. Mm-hmm. At that time, we did not have the technology to plant longleaf pine, because back then it was bare root seedlings only.
And they don't survive.
Right. And so what was planted back here was loblolly pine and even some Virginia pine. And so a lot of our native species, the pockets that were left got even more isolated because we were out here reforesting and planting species that are native, but they weren't native in the positions that were being planted. So historically, longleaf pine was up on the ridgetop here, and then as you come down the ridge, you graduate into loblolly and then down into loblolly hardwoods in the riparian areas. So we kind of altered the landscape even more when we started planting loblolly and Virginia pine in places that it wouldn't naturally be occurring here.
Yeah, we really misthought all of that back in those days, and
people were operating with what they knew.
Yeah.
The best science that was available at the time is what they were operating with. But as hindsight is 2020.
That's right.
We realized later on that and we developed new techniques. We came up with containerized seedlings for the longleaf pine and shortleaf pine, which allowed us to go back to planting native species here.
When we start talking about our Talladega National Forest here, from here up through Heflin up there, I think we're probably pretty close to 220,000 acres, something like that.
Yep.
And I've had people ask me this question: how in the world did the government get their hands on so many continuous acres as that? And the answer is really fairly simple, because nobody wanted to settle in those mountains. It was too rough. You couldn't grow nothing on it. So what they did is just let it go, and a lot of people would go in there, find 40 or 160 acres, pay the back taxes on it, and actually own it until they got the timber cut, and then they wouldn't pay the taxes, and it would go back. And my granddaddy used to do that. It would go back to the counties. So when the government came in here and they got with the counties and all of that kind of land, they just absorbed it and started taking care of it. And my daddy told me that when all that started, my granddaddy said, "Oh, this is going to be terrible. The government's going to own all the land and we won't have nowhere to hunt." That's what he used to say. But there again, y'all fooled us again, didn't you? Yeah.
We are. The U.S. Forest Service is a multiple use agency. So we manage our land for all uses. And hunting is definitely one of those uses that we manage our land for. But we manage our land for everybody. We have hikers, we have hunters, we have people that like to camp in RVs, people that ride four-wheelers. We do logging, we do mineral extraction, we're managing for T&E species. We are managing for lots of different things on the same land.
Most of your logging now is trying to improve the stands. Of course, TSI has always been in the back of your mind when you're doing something. You're trying to improve it. And a lot of times, people don't understand why you would clear cut a place. Well, you get to a point that you can't do anything else. I mean, that's just literally the problem. You know, for years, people would just cream it. They would go in there and cut all the best and leave the bad. And when y'all inherited all of that land, your agency did, we had a bunch of rotten apples that come from a bunch of other rotten apples. And that's just what happened. Y'all inherited a bunch of rotten trees, a hillside hardwood, the hollows, squirrel dens were everywhere, but they were pretty much useless trees. Yeah.
So we do have lots of silviculture treatments, and the type of cut we use depends on where on the landscape we are. It depends on what is desired for that area, and we have lots of different of management prescriptions. It can be, it can be for wildlife, it can be for recreation, and everything in between. And so it depends on where we are on the landscape to the silvicultural treatment that we give it. But you are right, we do have some stands that we do start over again, and usually it's because it's an off-site pine species. So you may have loblolly pine that's up on top of a ridge that's starting to get older. Rotation age for loblolly pine is 100 years. So if you have a 60 or 70-year-old stand of loblolly pine that has some different issues, whether it's been from southern pine beetle, just being in the wrong soil type, you can tell it's unhealthy, getting ready to die off. Those are the kind of areas that we can go in, we can clear cut, we can plant longleaf back into it, and start over again with the unit. But we're only going to do that in areas that we have plans to prescribe burn to maintain the longleaf. We don't want to we try and plant the appropriate species for the appropriate location. So there's lots of planning that goes into what the right treatment is in the right area.
Off-site management has caused a lot of problems in a lot of areas, and they didn't think it at one time. And Temple Inland up in northwest Georgia and northeast Alabama and into Tennessee, they had a lot of loblolly plantations up there that literally they were growing on those thin soils. They literally, when the southern pine beetles got started in them, they literally lost their trees paint to paint.
Yep.
Every tree was dead.
And we're seeing some of that again the last couple of years.
Yeah, last year was a bad year.
Yep. Overstocked loblolly stands have taken it especially hard, and they're just more susceptible to the southern pine beetle for a couple of reasons. Our younger, even longleaf plantations, you may see a couple of trees here and there that do get southern pine beetles, but due to the frequent fire that moves through those plantations, it thickens the barks, it thins the trees out more than what it does in a loblolly plantation.
That's right.
And they also have a lot more pitch to throw out the southern pine beetle. So for several reasons, you'll notice where we have lots of longleaf, we don't have the southern pine beetle issues that we do in our loblolly stands.
That's right. They have adapted to take care of themselves in those kind of, just like they do for fire.
Yep, and loblolly do not tolerate fire very well. We don't want to be burning loblolly plantations like we do a longleaf plantation because we'll have bad effects to it. So we have to burn differently when we're dealing with the off-site species.
Well, burning is one of the best tools y'all have for everything, even wildlife.
Yes, and it's what makes this area a desirable place for people to recreate and even hunt. Those early seral conditions where we're developing the understory, for insect production, for nests, for cover, for nutrition, we do that with fire.
Right.
Having the open canopy with frequent fires, how we get those conditions.
Now you've been doing some warm season burning too, which when I say warm season burning, I'm talking about burning like now, when the trees have already leaved out and everything. But there's been a lot of controversy about that, especially for turkey management, And I understand the collateral damage that you may have, but I don't think it's nothing like as big a problem as these people think it is. It's just not that big a problem.
The biggest reason to burn right now is because right now is the time of year where we can get the biggest herbaceous layer response.
Right.
And getting that more developed herbaceous layer leads to more successful nest and a higher percentage of poults being reared in the better cover, the better bugging ground that the poults have
That's
to be
right.
in. So that's why burning now is the most critical time. But burning also changes. When we're in the dormant season earlier in the year, when there's no canopy, the leaves are off the hardwoods, our fires tend to burn further down slope, and may get a little bit more in the drains. But as we go into the springtime and things are starting to green up, our fire behavior really changes, and where the fire carries really changes. So this time of year, if we're burning and we're lighting the top of a ridge, the fire is going to go out as you get to that transition zone between like loblolling the hardwoods and the drains. And a lot of times, even our nests from turkeys are going to be in those transition zones. That's not to say there won't be some nest up on the pine ridges as well, but they tend to be more towards the edges of those units and to be unaffected by fire. But they do receive the benefits of the better cover, the more developed herbaceous layer, and the higher insect production.
Now, when you say herbaceous, what we're talking about is stuff that, like mid-story trees, say sweet gum, maple, a lot of those kind of trees that grow up in an area the timber's been cut on, and they just literally cover it up. And you may have some perimeter nesting of those turkeys, but you won't have much out in the center of it. And so by burning it this way, you're going to kill the root and all.
Yeah, and so you also have to, if you look at the historical accounts, we talked about the tree density being low. A part that we didn't talk about was a lot of those early settlers also talk about you could ride 8 abreast on your horse, but the grass was waist high.
Yes.
They weren't talking about sweet gum waist high.
That's right.
They were talking about grass.
That's right.
And so there's a big difference, and that's how we get the game species that everybody loves. They need that well-developed herbaceous layer.
The turkeys, quail,
deer,
they thrive in that.
Everything requires that well-developed herbaceous layer.
Well, the deer like it because of the food. It's perfect brood habitat for the young turkeys to chase grasshoppers and that kind of stuff without fear of overhead predation.
Yes, providing cover from predators as well.
Yeah, that's great. Now, you know what would be a great idea as far as your RCW stuff? What if y'all were to kind of just manufacture a little fake excavated hole in there and try to get them to start using that? Have you ever thought about that?
We can do drilled cavities
Yeah.
in trees that are old enough.
Yes.
Where we can make entrance tunnels into the tree.
You have done that?
We can do that. We don't do a lot of it here because we don't have trees that are of that age grouped together to do many of them. So we can't go out and pioneer new sites with like 4 cavities per cluster because we may not have 4 of those trees there.
Right.
So we're still using artificial cavities at this point. I can tell a little bit more about the story on the Talladega Ranger District. We reintroduced the species in 2009. So they disappeared from here in the late 80s. So in 2009, we started putting in new clusters after doing lots of timber management, doing lots of prescribed burning. So we had 0 clusters in 2009, and this year we're up to about 50 active clusters here on the Talladega end. And we also have, at this point, quite a few natural cavities being excavated in our cluster sites. So we probably have 70 cluster sites down here on the south end of our district, and each cluster site may have maybe around 1 on average natural cavity at this point.
Really?
Yeah, so they are making progress, and those trees do exist here, but it's a little bit slower than going out and putting artificial cavities. And I can explain by artificial cavity, one of the reasons that this species has gone from endangered to threatened is in the 90s they invented an artificial cavity for the species that allowed us to go up in a tree with a chainsaw, cut a square hole into it, pull out a chunk of the tree, and put an artificial cavity in. And we could do that in trees as young as 60 years of age. So if you remember earlier I said in order to support a natural cavity, the tree has to be around 100 to 120 years of age. So we can cut the age of the tree in half and allow us to start to reintroduce this species in the ecosystem that we're restoring for it and many other species associated with the longleaf pine.
Now, a red-cockaded woodpecker actually lives in colonies, don't they? I mean, there's several. How many trees would be in a single colony?
So typically, it varies wildly. So we're providing 4 artificial cavities per cluster site here on the Talladega. Naturally, though, left to their own devices, a cluster site may have as many as 15 or 20 trees.
Really?
They may not all be active at once. Some may have flying squirrels, some may have snakes in them, some may have wasps, but the cavities will be there. And they can go in and clean out predators as they need to and reoccupy the cavity. We have less because we're in a growing population, so we shouldn't have more than a few birds in a cluster. So typically there'll be a breeding male and a breeding female. They each live in their own tree and in their own cavity. And then during nesting season, which is starting now, the female will lay the eggs in the male's tree. And the male will come feed the female while she's sitting on the eggs. The male may take turns sitting on the eggs, and they incubate their eggs. Then once the eggs hatch out, then they have to feed the chicks until they leave the cavity. And it usually takes around 23 days for the chicks to leave the cavity. So all for that 23 days, they're being fed like every 10 or 15 minutes. Everybody's going out, getting food, bringing it back, dropping it off to the young. And this is where subadults that were, maybe young from the year before will be helping the parents feed the young.
Yeah, that's just cool as it can be right there.
And so this group of birds will be out foraging, collecting insects, and bringing it in. And when they don't have young in the nest the rest of the year, they're foraging in family groups. They move through the forest. You can hear them calling back to each other. They're usually stratified, with the breeding male is usually up higher in the trees than the breeding female, and then the juveniles are lower down. And usually the higher you are in the hierarchy, the better foraging tree you get, which is the bigger flat top pine trees up in the top.
I never heard that before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. They they like to get the little bugs. Excuse me. Under the bark.
That's correct. And so, like many other of our game species, they're driven by the herbaceous layer. So that herbaceous layer that's fire maintained, that has all that diversity of plants, hosts a huge diversity of insects, which, it's good for the red cockaded woodpecker, but it's also good for the turkey. It's also good for the quail.
Yes.
Having that diversity of plants and insects gives you a lot more buffer when things go awry in nature. You have a plant that's not there one year and that insect's gone. Well, if you have another couple hundred different species, you've got things covered. But if you only have one type of plant and one type of insect, when you have environmental differences, your food can become very limited. And so in the longleaf pine ecosystem, with all that diversity, providing that diverse cover for a diverse host of insects that move up the trees or around in the herbaceous layer for other species to eat, that's what really makes the ecosystem unique and diverse and so good for game and T&E species.
A wildlife biologist told me one time, and Art, it may have been you, that you take a forest like that, the closer to the ground the diversity is, the healthier the forest is, wildlife included.
That's correct.
Yeah.
For that reason, the food web starts, with the soil and then the plants and moves up. A lot of the focus is on things above that layer that may consume that layer, but without that important component, everything else will suffer.
Okay, now I went with you one time, and we actually took your scope and went up there and looked at the babies up there, and eggs, and you were telling me about banding those chicks when they were just 3 days old, because I'll let you go into that and tell them why you do it that way when they're so young.
So when we started out, we were translocating birds from other populations and moving them here and releasing them to develop this population. So as part of that program, in order to participate, we are required to monitor our nest and our adults to know what's going on with our population. So part of that is banding the young after they hatch. And so we band our young between 6 and 10 days of age. So we have a very narrow window. So by day 6, the chick's leg is almost fully developed, which means it's almost as big as it's going to be, which means we can get the leg bands on. So we have a very narrow window when the leg is big enough, but the chick also has no feathers at that point. You can see feathers starting to poke through the tracks, but they're not extending out because we need to fish those birds out of the cavity with some fishing line and pull them out to put the leg bands on. And we have that very narrow window between 6 and 10 days where the leg is big enough And after day 10, the flight feathers are starting to emerge, and we don't want to damage the flight feathers as we're taking them out of the cavity. So we pull them out of the cavity, we put leg bands on them that are unique to that bird so we can identify them by the color combinations, but also there's a unique Fish and Wildlife Service number on a metal band on a leg that is entered into a database so that bird is tracked forever.
Well, I'm dang. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's always amazed me that those little birds would have a foot as big as it'll ever get when it's just a few days old.
Yeah.
It just blows my mind. My grandpa used to accuse me of having the biggest foot he had ever seen, even when I was young. But it wasn't nothing like that young.
Spent too much time in a longleaf forest.
I guess so. I guess I did. And the longleaf pine is unique to the southeastern United States, and especially the mountain longleaf. And it's my understanding that at one time we had around 100 million acres of longleaf, and now we're down to about 3 or 4 million. That's how much we've decimated our longleaf forest.
That's correct. And I think the numbers that I remember seem to stick in my head was originally around 113 million, and I think you're right, down to 3 million, but I think growing now.
Yes.
There's also more incentives for private landowners to plant longleaf pine as well. But the Forest Service is a little bit unique because this is one of the few places where you can go and see large-scale intact longleaf pine forest. So your two biggest options at this point are us and then Department of Defense. Training bases in the southeast have great longleaf pine because the military creates disturbance. Out there with tracer rounds starting fires, driving through the woods, our military training grounds have some of our best longleaf pine habitat in the southeast as well.
I remember somebody telling me, somebody with GP, they were pretty big up in the Carolinas too. They said that after the hurricane that hit Charleston, what was the name of that hurricane?
I'm trying to think.
Hugo? No, was it Hugo?
That was quite a while ago. That would have been back in the 90s, yeah.
Yeah, he said that you could ride through some of those pine forests and you could see every tree that had a cavity in it because it was broken there, when the rest of them might be either laying on the ground or broken in other places. But you could tell exactly where those cavities were in those.
The cavities definitely do weaken the trees, and our artificial cavities probably weaken the trees more than their natural cavities do.
I imagine they do, yeah.
Just given the age and the exposure to the different events. But one of the things we've also noticed is one of the requirements of the red-cockaded woodpecker is they prefer low basal areas. And so typically in areas where we do have a hurricane, the resulting reduction in basal area ends up increasing the population. Because we've reduced the base layer over such a large area, it's more efficient than we are. It covers more ground. No. Even though it snaps the cavities, we can go in and replace the cavities fairly quickly in what's left, but the result is usually an increase in the population. So the red-cockaded woodpecker really responds to logging operations. That reduction of basal area in conjunction with development of the herbaceous layer are the two critical things that it needs.
Well, there again, I'll explain to you basal area. What he's talking about there is the number of trees per acre, basically, and the size of the tree. It has something to do with that too. But
so historically, longleaf pine forests were probably a 40 to 50 basal area with the grassy herbaceous layer. Today's forests around here are probably more in the magnitude of 150 to 200 basal area with no herbaceous layer.
That's right.
So there's a drastic difference between historical.
That's what you call a wildlife desert.
Yes.
That's exactly what you call it.
Yes. And if you go out and drive through the Talladega National Forest, you'll see thousands of acres of longleaf pine forests that we burn, on a 2 to 5 year rotation that have the lower basal area. We're not able to go down to the 40 and 50 yet because we don't have our herbaceous layer established to the point that we can. Once we get that established, we can go down to those lower basal areas and be just fine and get the forests even more open than what they are.
Yes. Those turkeys and quail and deer, they need those natural grasses, and they need it thick for on the ground for protection, and they need it for the food, and it's excellent habitat for broods of turkeys because there's a lot of bugs, and those baby turkeys need a lot of protein, and that's where they get it.
Yep. And quail hunters too, that's the exact kind of habitat that if you want to go quail hunting in Alabama, you're probably going to go to an established pine plantation somewhere to find those conditions with the older trees and the frequent burning to hunt quail.
That is just that's amazing. A lot of people don't understand just how special the longleaf pine is and what it means to the other wildlife in our area. We are real fortunate to have this national forest here by us, and with the mindset of all of y'all for managing not only for wildlife but for the timber too and for the longleaf. And I appreciate it, and I appreciate y'all striking matches very often. And if you ever run out, let me know. I'll go get you some.
No, it is an interesting place to work because of the active management that we do. We need to do the logging, we need to do the burning, and we need to do it for lots of different reasons that all align together to restore the longleaf pine ecosystem. And I think that's what's made it interesting for me is we're managing not only for the threatened and endangered species, we're managing for the game species, and then we're managing for all the other things that are, the public like to do out on National Forest Service land.
I've also thought about this too. You take a lot of landowners that have land that join y'all. I'm one of them. And I see the value in longleaf pine. Now, a lot of them say, well, I'm not going to plant longleaf pine because it takes too long. Actually, the only place it takes long is coming out of the grass stage. Once it gets out of that grass stage, it takes off pretty good. But to me, it would be literally cheaper to do longleaf pine. The initial cost of planting it with containerized seedlings and whatever the maintenance of planting them is, that may be a little more expensive than doing bare root, but the less maintenance all you gotta do is burn it, or hope somebody else burns it.
Yeah.
And
then you also have to look about what are your other objectives besides raising timber? And so if your sole objective is to raise timber, maybe the loblolly plantation is the way to go. But if you have another objective, maybe it is to bring turkey and quail to your land. Well, then maybe the longleaf pine will be more attractive, even though it is a little bit slower. It may cost a little bit more money, but maybe in 30 years you might have something that you can really attract the game species that you're interested in to your land.
And the fact that they're bug resistant and
Yes.
fire resistant, that ought to be a consideration for a landowner because you literally don't have to worry about southern pine beetles.
And then it would depend on your rotation age that you desire for your land. So if you're going to have a longer rotation age, longleaf pine would definitely make more sense because it would be more resistant to the SPB infestations as well.
Well, that was great. I really appreciate you coming by today and taking a few minutes here to talk with us. And whenever you take Jeff or any of y'all got an issue, maybe I tell you what, another good one would be your fire guy.
Okay.
Who is doing that now?
Sean Snyder is our FMO now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, get your FMO to come and talk about why y'all wake up in the morning and the exchange is just smoked out. There's smoke everywhere. Why is that? A lot of people complain, but they don't know the real reason for it. And that would be a great thing to do. And then, of course, maybe your recreation guy want to come talk about their lakes and Coleman Lake and Lake Cheneby and these kind of places about what's going on there. And they're all welcome anytime, as you well know.
Yep. Yep.
And we'll get you back in here and press you on some real tough issues.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
Okay,
Sounds
baby.
like a plan.
Well, thanks a lot.
Yep.
To Munford our home and all its glory on display, and to the Cheaha legends that'll never fade away.